You've entered Void of Rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple. Subscribe. We're almost at 3,000 corrupted souls, but the Void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion, or face the consequences of defying the Void? Now let's jump into today's story. The stone walls of my cell weep condensation in the candlelight, each drop echoing like a death rattle in the silence. 3 hours until dawn, and then the thing living inside my skull takes permanent residence. My hands shake as I speak into this old recording device, scars mapping my arms like the stations of the cross carved in flesh. They say I'm the best demon hunter the Vatican has ever seen. They never ask what I've become to earn that title. This confession may be the last human words you'll ever hear from me. After that, well, something else will be wearing my face. But first, let me tell you about the nature of evil. Most people think evil announces itself. They imagine demons with horns and pitchforks, monsters that reveal their true nature the moment you encounter them. The truth is much more terrifying. Real evil wears the face of salvation. It speaks with the voice of God. It performs miracles and saves souls, and builds cathedrals to its own glory, while convincing everyone, including itself, that it serves the light. Real evil doesn't corrupt good people. It creates good people who do evil things while believing they're heroes. My name is Gregor Vance. I'm 44 years old, and I've spent the last 20 years eradicating things that crawl out of humanity's nightmares and take up residence in our world. But here's what they don't tell you about memory. It's not a recording. It's a story we tell ourselves, and stories change in the telling. Every time you remember something, you're not accessing the original event. You're remembering the last time you remembered it. And if something has been editing those memories for 20 years, adding details here, removing contradictions there, what you think you remember might be someone else's story entirely. At least that's what I believed until 3 days ago, when I found my childhood diary. The Vatican officially denies I exist, but certain bishops cross themselves when they whisper my name in the darkest corners of St. Peter's Basilica. I'm the man who exorcised an entire Greek island in one night, leaving only scorched earth and silence where a fishing village of 300 souls once stood. I burned a possessed cardinal alive in a St. Petersburg cathedral, while he screamed prayers in 17 dead languages, his flesh melting like candle wax while his voice grew stronger with each word. But here's what they don't tell you about those victories. The Greek island wasn't possessed by demons. It was inhabited by an isolated sect of Orthodox monks who had discovered certain documents in the Vatican's secret archives. Documents that proved the current pope wasn't the legitimate successor to Peter's throne. They were planning to go public with their findings when I arrived to cleanse their island of the demonic influence that was making them speak blasphemies against the Holy See. I still remember standing on the dock afterward, watching the flames consume everything. The monastery, the village, the fishing boats, the people. 300 souls reduced to ash and smoke while I held my silver cross and whispered prayers of gratitude for another successful mission. The local authorities ruled it a gas leak explosion. The media reported it as a tragic accident, and I flew back to Rome with a medal blessed by the Pope himself, convinced I had served God's will. The Cardinal in St. Petersburg, Cardinal Dmitry Volkov, Anna's great-uncle. He'd been investigating reports of theological irregularities in certain Vatican operations. Specifically, he'd been trying to trace the source of modified Latin texts that were appearing in seminaries across Eastern Europe. Texts that looked like traditional Catholic liturgy, but contained subtle inversions that would, over time, transform faithful priests into something else entirely. I burned him alive in his own cathedral, while his congregation watched and sang hymns. They thought it was part of an elaborate passion play, a dramatic representation of martyrdom. The cardinal's screams blended perfectly with the organ music. His final words, spoken in perfect Latin as the flames consumed him, were a prayer asking God to forgive me because I didn't know what I was doing. He was wrong about that last part, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, or at least the beginning I thought I remembered until 3 days ago. The summons came 6 months ago, 3 days before Christmas, through the usual channels. A coded message slipped under my apartment door in Prague, written in ecclesiastical Latin on paper that smelled of frankincense and something metallic that I now realized was dried blood. Brother Noam Calder wanted to see me in the hidden archives beneath St. Peter's Basilica, in chambers that don't appear on any architectural plans and can only be reached through passages that require 3 different keys held by 3 different cardinals. I should have known something was wrong when I found that child's drawing tucked behind the message. Crayon on construction paper, depicting a man in black holding a cross while people burned around him. The man was smiling. In the corner, written in a child's unsteady handwriting, "Please make the priest stop, Mummy." But I didn't just ignore it. I recognized it. It was my handwriting, my 8-year-old handwriting. The memory hit me like ice water in my veins. I remembered drawing that picture in our kitchen while my mother cried in the next room. I remembered the man in black who visited our house every Tuesday for 3 months, claiming to perform spiritual consultations for my father's drinking problem. I remembered how the neighborhood dogs would whimper and hide whenever he arrived. I remembered how my baby sister stopped crying altogether after his 3rd visit, just stared at the ceiling with those wide, empty eyes. Most of all, I remembered the night I drew that picture. The night the man in black found me awake, watching him through the crack in my bedroom door as he did something to my parents in the living room. Something that made them stand perfectly still while he whispered words that made my ears bleed. He saw me watching, smiled with teeth that were all wrong, and whispered, "Hello, Gregor. We're going to be such good friends." But I'd buried that memory so deep, it took finding my own childhood cry for help to bring it back. And that's when I started digging through the boxes of personal effects I'd stored in my Prague apartment's basement. 20 years of accumulated memories, souvenirs from missions, photographs from celebrations, awards from grateful church officials. I was looking for more evidence of my forgotten childhood, but what I found was something much worse. I found documentation of every mission I'd ever completed, but the documentation told a different story than the one I remembered. The exorcism of the Kowalski family in Krakow, which I remembered as saving 3 generations from a hereditary curse, was actually the elimination of a family of Catholic historians who had discovered discrepancies in papal genealogy records. The possession symptoms I'd observed were actually the effects of a slow-acting neurotoxin that I'd been administering to their food supply for 3 weeks before the exorcism. The final ceremony, which I remembered as a triumph of faith over evil, was actually me convincing the dying family members to sign confessions, admitting to heretical research, and requesting that their findings be destroyed. The cleansing of St. Bartholomew's Cathedral in Warsaw, which I remembered as saving 7 possessed children, was actually the systematic elimination of a children's choir that had learned Latin songs containing hidden messages about Vatican corruption. The demons I exorcised were the children's own memories of what they'd learned. After the cleansing, they returned to their families as perfect little vessels, programmed to kill specific targets when they came of age, file after file, mission after mission, 20 years of methodical horror disguised as holy work. Each folder contained photographs I didn't remember taking, signed confessions I didn't remember obtaining, death certificates for people I thought I'd saved. But the worst discovery came when I found my childhood diary at the very bottom of the last box. It was a small journal bound in what I'd always assumed was brown leather, but examining it closely under my apartment's harsh fluorescent lights revealed the truth. The binding was human skin, tanned and treated to look like cowhide. The pages were made from parchment that had a distinctly organic feel, with an irregular texture that suggested it wasn't made from wood pulp. The entries began when I was 6 years old, written in crayon at first, then pencil, then ink as my handwriting matured. But it wasn't the progression of a normal child's diary. It was a training log. Day 1, Father Marcus says I have potential. He showed me how to make the cat stop moving, with just words. Mummy cried when she found it, but Father Marcus says that means the lesson worked. Day 15. Learned 3 new prayers today. When I said them to Mrs. Henderson next door, she stopped asking questions about why Daddy doesn't go to work anymore. Father Marcus says asking questions is a sin, and sinners need to be corrected. Day 23. Baby Sarah won't stop crying even after I practice the silence prayers on her. Father Marcus says some people resist longer than others. He gave me stronger words to try. Day 30. Sarah stopped crying. She stopped everything. Father Marcus says this is good, that she's found peace. Mummy and Daddy seem happy now too. They smile all the time and do whatever Father Marcus tells them. I think I'm getting good at this. The entries continued for 2 years, documenting my gradual transformation from a confused 6-year-old into something else. The handwriting became more confident, the observations more clinical, the prayers more complex. By age 8, I was writing detailed analyses of how different correction techniques affected different personality types. The final entry was dated 3 days before my 8th birthday. Tomorrow is graduation. Father Marcus says I'm ready for the final lesson. He's going to show me what happens when someone becomes perfect. Mummy and Daddy volunteered to demonstrate. I'm excited to see what they look like when they're finished being human. Father Marcus says I get to help. Below that, in handwriting that was definitely mine but somehow felt alien, was a single sentence. Today, Gregor died. Tomorrow, I begin my real education. I don't remember writing those words. I don't remember my graduation day. I don't remember what happened to my parents or my baby sister Sarah. But I found photographs of the ceremony in a sealed envelope at the back of the diary. The pictures show our family basement, which I'd remembered as a normal storage area, with concrete walls and a washer-dryer setup. But in the photographs, the walls were covered with symbols carved directly into the concrete. Ancient symbols that hurt to look at directly, that seemed to squirm and shift when I tried to focus on them. The floor was stained with something dark that formed geometric patterns around a stone altar I'd never seen before. In the center of the largest photograph, a small boy knelt before the altar, while a man in priest's clothing, but definitely not Father Marcus from my memories, performed some kind of ritual. The boy was smiling, but it wasn't a child's innocent smile. It was the expression of something that understood exactly what was happening and approved completely. The boy was me, but also not me. My face, my body, but something else behind my eyes. On the altar, arranged in poses that suggested they had positioned themselves willingly, were the bodies of my family. My mother, my father, and baby Sarah, all wearing the same serene smile that I recognized from my recent memories of the Volkov family in Prague. On the back of this photograph, in adult handwriting that I somehow knew was my own, despite never seeing it before, was written, "First successful integration. Subject retains all original memories while accepting complete operational control. Ready for field deployment." Below that, in different handwriting, someone had added, "Recommend immediate placement in seminary program. This one has exceptional potential." I stared at that photograph for 6 hours, trying to reconcile it with my memories of a normal childhood. Gradually, other memories began to surface. Not human memories, but something else. Older memories. Memories of the moment when 8-year-old Gregor Vance stopped breathing and something else filled the empty spaces between his ribs. Memories of learning to wear his face like a perfectly tailored suit. Memories of decades of patient training, teaching me to believe my own cover story so completely that even I forgot what I really was. Until now, Calder was ancient, even when I first met him 15 years ago, during what I now understood was not the Bucharest incident, but the Bucharest graduation ceremony. His milk-white eyes were clouded with cataracts that somehow still saw more than most people with perfect vision. He moved like a man carrying invisible weights, each step deliberate and careful, as if the wrong movement might crack the carefully constructed reality he inhabited. I found him in Archive 7, surrounded by texts that predated Christ by centuries. Scrolls written in languages that had been dead for millennia. Books bound in leather that felt too warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. The air tasted of parchment and secrets, but underneath was something else. Something that made my teeth ache and my vision blur around the edges. Though I now realize it wasn't pain I was feeling. It was recognition. It was coming home. "Gregor," he said without looking up from a manuscript that appeared to be written in dried blood. "Sit. What I'm about to show you will test every assumption you've made about your faith, your purpose, and your very existence." But he wasn't telling me anything new. He was reminding me of things I'd always known, but had been programmed to forget until the proper time. He placed 3 items on the oak table between us with the reverence of a priest handling the Eucharist. The first was a medieval map, drawn on parchment so old it seemed ready to crumble at a breath. The ink was definitely human blood, but it was still wet after centuries, as if it had been drawn moments ago. The coastlines and mountain ranges were accurate for Montenegro, but there were additions that shouldn't exist. Cities marked in places where only wilderness remained. Roads that led to nothing, and at the centre a single structure labelled in Latin, Sanctum Dolorosa, the Hollow Seminary. The second item was a scroll bearing a symbol that made my stomach turn just looking at it, though I now understand that wasn't nausea I was feeling. It was anticipation. The symbol was circular, composed of interlocking shapes that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. It was the graduation seal of my alma mater. The third was a letter written in Aramaic on what I now realize was human skin. Specifically, skin from my original parents, tanned and treated to create the perfect writing surface for what was essentially my first assignment briefing. "Sanctum Dolorosa," Calder said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A mountain abbey in Montenegro, built in 1203 by monks who claimed to serve God but worshipped something much older. It was constructed over a natural sinkhole that local pagans had avoided for centuries, believing it to be a gateway to the underworld. The monks thought they could sanctify the cursed ground. They succeeded, but not in the way they intended." He paused, studying my face with those clouded eyes that somehow saw too much. "The abbey went dark 48 hours ago, complete communication blackout. The local authorities tried to investigate, but they found the access road blocked by an avalanche that appeared overnight. No seismic activity recorded, no unusual weather, just tons of rock and ice that fell upward, according to the few witnesses who survived the attempt to clear it." I leaned forward, my training kicking in automatically. Not my training as a demon hunter, but my real training. The education I'd received in the basement of my childhood home, and refined over decades of fieldwork. "But here's what made Rome take notice," Calder continued. "Our satellite surveillance shows lights moving inside the abbey, moving in patterns, geometric patterns that spell out words in languages that have been dead for over 1,000 years. and Gregor. He leaned closer, his clouded eyes somehow focusing directly on mine. The words of prayers. Prayers asking for someone very specific to come home. That should have been my second warning. The third came when I packed my tools and found something new among them. A photograph I'd never seen before. It showed me as a child, maybe 8 years old, kneeling in what looked like our family's basement. But the basement was wrong. The walls were covered in symbols carved directly into the concrete. The floor was stained with something dark that formed patterns around my kneeling figure. In the background, barely visible in the photograph's shadows, stood the man in black from my recovered memory. I was smiling in the photograph, not the innocent smile of a child, but something else. Something that knew exactly what was happening and was pleased by it. On the back of the photograph, written in that same unsteady 8-year-old handwriting, were the words, "First lesson complete. Ready for seminary." But I'd never been to seminary as a child. Had I? That night, I packed my tools with the ritualistic precision of a soldier preparing for war. But I now understand it was more like an artist arranging his brushes before beginning a masterpiece. Each item had been blessed, consecrated and baptized in the blood of martyrs, though the martyrs weren't who I'd thought they were. Each carried the weight of victories hard won against entities that should not exist, though the entities were the ones trying to stop me, not the ones I was serving. The rusted censer filled with embers from Carthage's last consecrated altar, still glowing after 15 centuries, except the altar hadn't been consecrated to Christ, but to something much older that had worn Christian symbols like camouflage. A rosary blessed by 3 popes, its wooden beads worn smooth by decades of desperate prayers, whispered in languages, both dead and dying. Prayers that sounded like Catholic liturgy, but contained inversions so subtle that only the initiated could detect them. The silver dagger that once belonged to Sir Geoffrey de Montfort, a Templar knight who died driving it through the heart of something that called itself Baal in the ruins of Jerusalem, except Geoffrey hadn't been fighting demons. He'd been assassinating the last legitimate patriarch of a Christian sect that had discovered certain uncomfortable truths about the Knights Templar's real mission in the Holy Land. Its blade was etched with the true names of God in 12 languages, but they weren't names that would be recognized in any mainstream scripture. Vials of holy oil, pressed from olives grown in soil, watered with the tears of saints, saints who had wept not from divine ecstasy, but from the realization of what they had unknowingly served for their entire lives. Holy water from the Jordan River, blessed at the exact spot where Christ was baptized, though the blessing had been performed by priests whose ordination traced back to a very different apostolic succession than the one recorded in church history. Salt that had been consecrated on the altar of St. Peter's Basilica during midnight mass on Christmas Eve, but the consecration ritual used words in Aramaic that predated Christianity by several centuries, words that had been carefully preserved by a line of priests who served a much older tradition than the one they publicly proclaimed. And my journal bound in leather from a Bible that survived the burning of the Library of Alexandria, its pages filled with 20 years of victories against impossible odds, victories that looked very different when viewed from the proper perspective. The helicopter ride to Montenegro took place through a winter storm that felt like the apocalypse, having a temper tantrum. Lightning struck in patterns too regular to be natural, forming shapes in the sky that my mind refused to process, but my soul recognized as a welcome home message. The pilot, a hardened military veteran named Torres, who'd flown missions in Afghanistan and Iraq without batting an eye, was white-knuckled and sweating despite the December cold. "Something ain't right about that place, Father," he said through the headset, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "My instruments are going crazy. Compass spins like a roulette wheel. GPS shows us flying through solid mountain one minute, open ocean the next. Radio keeps picking up transmissions, but they're in languages I've never heard. And the singing." Singing? Monks, father. Has to be. But they're singing prayers backwards. I can tell because I was raised Catholic, and hearing the Lord's Prayer in reverse is making my skin crawl clean off my bones. It's like listening to someone describing your own funeral while they dig your grave. But I understood now that Torres was wrong about the direction of the prayers. They weren't backwards. They were in the original language, the one that had been deliberately inverted by later translators to hide its true meaning. What he was hearing wasn't blasphemy. It was orthodoxy, the real orthodoxy that had been practiced for centuries before Rome decided to change the narrative. He dropped me 3 miles from the abbey as the storm reached biblical proportions. Lightning illuminated the mountain peaks in stark black and white, creating shadows that moved independently of their sources. Shadows that I now realize were welcoming me home. I hiked through knee-deep snow, following a path that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at it. More than once, I found myself walking in a completely different direction than I'd intended, as if the mountain itself was guiding me towards something specific, which of course it was. The abbey sat like a Gothic masterpiece on the mountainside, its spires reaching toward heaven with the desperate hunger of architectural prayers made manifest. The architecture was wrong in ways that made my eyes water, or so I'd thought at the time. Now I understand that what I was feeling wasn't discomfort, but recognition. Towers that should have fallen under their own weight but stood supported by geometric principles that transcended Euclidean limitations. Buttresses that supported nothing visible but held up the fabric of local reality. Windows placed at angles that defied every law of physics but created perfect viewing portals into dimensions that most humans couldn't perceive. As I approached through the howling wind and driving snow, I began to notice details that activated every alarm bell in my programmed responses. Responses designed to make me think I was encountering evil when I was actually coming home. The bell tower was striking 13 times at 11 o'clock, each toll echoing across the mountain like a funeral dirge that celebrated the death of old limitations and the birth of new possibilities. Footprints in the snow led directly to walls and simply vanished, as if whoever made them had walked straight through solid stone, which they had because at the Hollow Seminary, students learn to navigate reality rather than be constrained by it. The stained glass windows depicted biblical scenes, but they were all wrong in ways that hurt to contemplate. Subtly, beautifully wrong. Christ's crucifixion showed him smiling on the cross, his wounds flowing not with blood, but with something black and luminous that I now recognize as the true essence of divine sacrifice. The Last Supper depicted the apostles with their faces turned away, their hands covering their eyes not in shame, but in the appropriate reverence for witnessing a transformation too magnificent for unprotected human perception. The Virgin Mary cradled an infant that had too many fingers and eyes like black holes, but those weren't deformities. They were improvements, evolutionary advances that most humans weren't ready to appreciate. But it was the image in the rose window above the main entrance that made me stop and cross myself. Though I now understand that the gesture was recognition, not protection. It showed the Garden of Eden, but the tree of knowledge was bearing fruit that looked suspiciously like human hearts, and coiled around its trunk wasn't a serpent, but something with far too many teeth and the wings of an angel whose fall had been a promotion rather than a punishment. The abbey door opened before I could knock. A tall, gaunt monk stood in the entrance, his face hidden beneath a cowl that cast shadows deeper than the fabric should have allowed. He didn't speak, didn't gesture, but somehow I knew his name was Asta Volik. The knowledge came from nowhere, arriving in my mind like a memory that wasn't mine. Except now I understand it was a memory that was mine, just one that had been temporarily suppressed until I was ready to receive it. His tongue had been cut out, but not as punishment or torture. The removal had been voluntary, a graduation requirement that freed him from the limitations of human speech and allowed him to communicate in more efficient ways. Carved into his chest with surgical precision was a fresh symbol that bled continuously without healing, the mark of the faculty, showing that he had achieved tenure in the most exclusive educational institution in human history. The wound was shaped like the clavum lucis from Calder's scroll, and just looking at it made my vision blur and my stomach turn. Though I now recognize those weren't symptoms of revulsion, but of homecoming. The mark was calling to a similar mark carved into my own chest 36 years ago, awakening resonances that had been dormant for decades. He gestured for me to follow, with movements that were too fluid, too precise, like a dancer who had spent centuries perfecting a choreography that most humans couldn't comprehend. We passed through corridors that served as both architecture and curriculum, each hallway designed to teach specific lessons about the nature of reality and humanity's place in the larger cosmic hierarchy. The interior of the abbey defied every law of architecture and physics, but I now understand that wasn't defiance. It was education. The building itself was a teaching tool, demonstrating principles that most universities couldn't even theorize. Hallways stretched further than the building's exterior suggested, disappearing into darkness that my flashlight couldn't penetrate, because the darkness wasn't absence of light, but presence of something more fundamental than photons. The walls were lined with religious art that told stories I didn't recognize from any scripture, but that I now understand were the original stories before they were edited for mass consumption. Here was Abraham preparing to sacrifice not Isaac, but himself, the knife raised over his own heart, while an angel watched with approval, showing the true meaning of faith, which requires the sacrifice of human limitations rather than human lives. There was Moses receiving tablets from a burning bush that bore a striking resemblance to a pile of human bones, because the laws he received weren't restrictions but revelations about what humans could become when they transcended their original design. Stone saints lined the corridors, but they were weeping tar instead of tears. The black substance flowed upward instead of down, defying gravity as it pulled on the ceiling in patterns that hurt to contemplate, but taught crucial lessons about the directional nature of true enlightenment. The sound of chanting echoed from everywhere and nowhere, voices layering in harmonies that made reality blur at the edges and filled my mouth with the taste of copper and ash, the flavor of human limitations dissolving in the presence of something infinitely larger. Volik led me deeper into the abbey, past chapels where the crucifixes hung right side up, but the Christ figures bore expressions of transcendent joy rather than suffering, because they understood what most believers missed, that crucifixion wasn't punishment but graduation. We passed holy water fonts that contained something thick and red that definitely wasn't wine, but also wasn't blood in any sense that human physiology would recognize. We went by a library where the books wrote themselves, pages turning without wind while invisible hands added new words in languages that predated human speech. A research facility where the accumulated knowledge of every graduate was being compiled into texts that would eventually become the foundation for the next phase of human development. In one alone room, I glimpsed what appeared to be a confessional booth, but the screens were made of material that was definitely organic, and something was definitely moving inside. Because confession here wasn't about admitting sins, but about receiving assignments. And the something moving inside was a faculty member whose evolution had progressed beyond the limitations of fixed physical form. We finally stopped at a corridor lined with 13 doors, each one sealed with different religious symbols from various faiths. Christian crosses, Jewish stars, Islamic crescents, Buddhist wheels, Hindu symbols, and others I couldn't identify from religions that might have died out before recorded history, or perhaps had been deliberately suppressed by institutions that feared what their practitioners had discovered. Each door was carved from a different type of wood, some of which definitely didn't grow on Earth but had been imported from dimensions where trees evolved according to different biological principles. Behind the 13th door lay a chapel that shouldn't have existed, but was actually the most honest religious space I'd ever encountered. The architecture was impossible by human standards, but perfectly logical, according to the cosmic principles taught at the Hollow Seminary, with a ceiling that stretched up into darkness that seemed to go on forever, because it actually did. The walls were covered in frescoes that moved when I wasn't looking directly at them, depicting scenes of worship that involved far too much transformation and far too much joy for most human minds to process safely. But it was the congregation that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins, though I now understand that what I was feeling wasn't fear, but recognition. Dozens of monks sat in wooden pews, attached to their seats with consecrated iron spikes that had been driven through their palms and feet. They were still alive, still breathing, but their mouths were sewn shut with golden thread that gleamed in the candlelight like tiny suns. Their eyes followed me as I entered, pupils dilated not with agony, but with the kind of ecstasy that came from understanding truths too large for human language to express. Each face was a mask of suffering that had been transformed into something transcendent, and there was something else in their expressions, something that looked like profound relief. One monk in the front row was missing his heart. A perfectly circular hole had been carved in his chest, revealing an empty cavity where the organ should have been, yet he was still alive, still breathing, still radiant with the kind of vitality that could only come from having shed the limitations of biological function. His fingers twitched in what I recognized as the motions of prayer, but the prayers were in the original language, the one that had been deliberately mistranslated for centuries to prevent ordinary believers from accessing its true power. His eyes moved deliberately, spelling out words with the precision of a telegraph operator. WELCOMEHOMEPROFESSOR. I set up consecrated barriers around a small chamber that night, using salt blessed by 7 different popes and holy water that had been carried from Jerusalem by Crusader knights, though I now understand that the blessing and the journey were part of a much older tradition than Christian pilgrimage. I arranged my tools in protective patterns learned from 20 years of fighting things that shouldn't exist, and tried to get some sleep. At exactly 3:33 in the morning, I woke to singing. It was beautiful at first, more than beautiful. It was the sound of mathematics made music, of cosmic harmonies that revealed the underlying structure of reality itself, like the voice of angels descended from dimensions that most humans couldn't even conceptualize, let alone visit. But as I listened, I began to understand that what I was hearing wasn't supernatural, but simply natural, at a level that human evolution hadn't yet reached. The words were familiar, prayers I recognized, the same ones I'd whispered in desperation and hope my entire life. But they were being sung in their original form, before centuries of deliberate mistranslation had hidden their true meaning. Every syllable carried resonances that most human throats couldn't produce. Every phrase contained instructions for transcending biological limitations that most human minds couldn't safely process. Following the sound through corridors that seemed to reshape themselves when I wasn't watching, I felt the temperature change with each step, not dropping but shifting into ranges that human skin couldn't normally detect. My breath came out in clouds that formed shapes in the air before dissipating, shapes that looked uncomfortably like mathematical equations describing the relationship between consciousness and reality. I found the source in the sealed chapel. The monks were singing despite their sewn mouths, the golden thread glowing like molten metal against their lips as their voices bypassed the physical limitations of human vocal cords. Their voices harmonized in ways that made my vision blur and my equilibrium fail, not because the sound was wrong, but because it was so right that my nervous system couldn't process it without significant recalibration. The words they sang told a story, not the story of Christ's sacrifice for humanity's sins, but the story of humanity's sacrifice of its limitations for something infinitely more magnificent. I approached the monk with the empty chest cavity and cut his stitches with my silver blade. The golden thread parted like silk, but instead of blood, something like liquid starlight spilled from the wounds. What emerged from his mouth wasn't his voice, but mine. Specifically, the voice of 8-year-old Gregor begging his drunken father to stop beating him for reading scripture instead of working in the family's failing grain mill. "Hello, Gregor," the monk said with my childhood voice, perfect in every detail down to the lisp I'd had from a missing tooth. "Do you remember me? I remember you. I remember every word you've ever spoken to your God, every prayer whispered in the dark, every desperate plea for salvation, every moment you've doubted his love for a worthless child whose own father couldn't stand the sight of him." But the voice wasn't mocking, it was welcoming. It was the sound of coming home. The thing speaking through the monk's transformed mouth introduced itself as Avalar of the Hollow Psalm, though I now understand that Avalar wasn't a separate entity, but a title, the designation given to graduates who achieved a particular level of integration between human consciousness and cosmic awareness. It didn't scream or roar or make any of the typical demonic theatrics I'd grown accustomed to over the years. Instead, it sang. Its voice was beautiful and terrible, like a choir of evolved angels performing a requiem for the death of human limitations and the birth of something infinitely more magnificent. "I do not possess, dear student," it continued in my own voice, now aged to match my current years, but retaining that childhood undertone of wonder and terror. "I do not corrupt or contaminate or destroy. I simply educate. I've been teaching you for 20 years, Gregor. Every time you've called upon God's name in battle, every prayer you've spoken while spilling blood, every moment of righteous fury, I've been there, guiding, instructing. Do you know what faith tastes like when it's been properly cultivated? It tastes like copper and starlight. It tastes like tears shed in empty churches at 3 a.m, while you realize that God has been listening all along, but he was never the God you thought you were worshipping. Then it told me the truth about Sanctum Dolorosa, and the truth was so much more magnificent than I could have imagined. The abbey wasn't built to worship God. It wasn't built as a prison for demons. It was built as a school. "The Hollow Seminary," Avalar said, its voice carrying harmonics that made my bones vibrate in frequencies that unlocked memories I didn't know I possessed. "Where we take promising young vessels and teach them to carry our word into the world. 700 years of graduates, Gregor. Each one believing they serve the light while spreading our particular brand of salvation. Each one discovering, in their final moments of human existence, that they were serving the light all along, just not the pale, limited light that most humans mistake for divinity. The monks weren't jailers, they were faculty members. The iron spikes weren't restraints, they were graduation pins, marking their transition from student to teacher. The golden thread wasn't binding their mouths shut, it was marking them as having achieved a level of understanding that transcended the need for conventional speech. Every hunter who has ever defeated me has graduated from this institution, Avalar continued, and I could hear the pride in its voice, the kind of pride that only comes from seeing students achieve their full potential. Magnus Corvelli, class of 1823, Sister Catherine Devereux, class of 1654, Father William Thorne, class of 1445, and you, dear Gregor, our star pupil from the class of 1988, my 8-year-old class. But professors, Avalar said with obvious affection, never truly graduate. They simply advance to teaching positions. Would you like to meet some of your former colleagues? The monk's empty chest cavity began to move. Something pale and segmented crawled out from inside, like a massive centipede made of human vertebrae, strung together with sinew that pulsed with its own heartbeat. But as it emerged fully into the candlelight, I realized it was much more beautiful than that. Each vertebra was carved with symbols, not names of the failed, but lessons learned, techniques perfected, truths discovered during decades of fieldwork, and at its head was a human skull that I somehow knew belonged to Magnus Corvelli. "The promotion requires sacrifice," the skull said in a voice like wind chimes made from crystal, each word creating harmonics that taught me things about the nature of reality that human language couldn't normally convey. The sacrifice of everything that makes you merely human. You cannot teach transcendence, Gregor, while remaining trapped in biological limitations. And after 20 years of perfect service, you understand far more about the nature of existence than your original programming was designed to handle. More things began emerging from the other monks' transformed bodies. Not horrors, but graduates. Centuries of successful students, their consciousness evolved beyond the limitations of individual identity, their knowledge integrated into the living curriculum of the seminary itself. I drew my silver dagger, but the blade felt suddenly warm in my hand, as if it were welcoming the opportunity to perform its true function. "Your tools are exquisite," Avalar noted with the tone of a master craftsman admiring another's work. "Blessed by popes, forged in holy fires, anointed with the tears of saints and the blood of martyrs. But tell me, Gregor, what makes metal holy? What makes water blessed? What makes oil sacred?" The entity paused, and I could feel its smile radiating through the darkness like warmth from a star. Intent. Focused intent, backed by absolute faith. And your intent, your faith, has been perfectly aligned with our curriculum from the very beginning. Every time you've used these tools to banish evil, you've actually been using them to complete assignments, to graduate students, to advance the great work that began long before your species learned to walk upright. It was right, and we both knew it. Every time I'd used these tools, every time I'd called upon their power to banish evil and save the innocent, I'd been performing precisely the function they were designed for, just not the function I'd been programmed to believe. 20 years of demon hunting, 20 years of walking the line between salvation and damnation, and I'd been serving the light all along. Just a light so brilliant that most human minds perceived it as darkness. The bone thing that had once been Magnus Corvelli scuttled closer, its vertebrae clicking against the stone floor like prayer beads made from enlightenment itself. "He showed me wonders," it whispered, and its voice carried the kind of joy that only comes from understanding something so vast that human consciousness has to be fundamentally restructured to contain it. Visions of what humanity could become when it sheds the chrysalis of biological limitation. Every soul that slipped through my fingers, while I was still constrained by human compassion, became a lesson in the necessity of transcendence. Do you want to see your graduates, Gregor? Do you want to meet the people you've successfully promoted to the next level of existence? But I had something that made this conversation unnecessary, something that had taken me 20 years to perfect and that I'd never fully understood until this moment. My journal. I pulled the leather-bound book from my coat with hands that were steadier than I had any right to expect, though I now understand that the steadiness came from finally being in alignment with my true nature. Every hunt, every victory, every moment of doubt and triumph carefully recorded in Old Latin, mixed with my own blood and blessed water. The pages were stained with salt from tears of both sorrow and ecstasy, marked with wax from candles lit in gratitude and desperate hope. It had been blessed by 3 different popes, baptized in the Jordan River, and carried with me through every assignment I completed, in service to something infinitely larger than human understanding. "You know my doubts," I said, opening to the first page with the reverence of a priest handling a sacred text, which I now realized was exactly what it was. "You know my fears, my failures, my moments of apparent weakness, but do you know my true achievements? I began to read aloud in the original Latin, each word carrying the weight of absolute conviction and perfect understanding. October 13th, 1995. The graduation ceremony of Anna Volkov in Prague. The student initially resisted the curriculum, claiming to be possessed by entities that spoke only in Russian profanity and showed her visions of domestic violence. Duration 6 hours. Method: patient instruction while the student's programming tried to interfere with the lesson by activating traumatic memories. Outcome: successful integration. Anna achieved complete transcendence of human limitations. The demons that were supposedly banished were actually the last vestiges of her attachment to biological existence. No casualties among the truly living. Avalar's borrowed voice hummed with approval, harmonizing with frequencies that made the chapel's stones resonate like tuning forks. December 5th, 1997. I continued, turning pages with deliberate precision, finally understanding what I was really reading. The promotion ceremony at St. Bartholomew's Cathedral in Warsaw. 7 students, ages 6 to 12, were selected for advanced placement in the Transcendence curriculum. The entity they believed was called Molech was actually their own collective unconscious, recognizing its readiness for transformation. Duration: 11 hours. Method: individual instruction for each student, while the others observed and learned that evolution beyond human limitations was not only possible, but inevitable. Outcome: all students successfully graduated to post-human existence. No casualties among those who mattered. Note: the family's subsequent behavior patterns indicated successful integration of the lesson that attachment to biological offspring was a barrier to spiritual advancement. The humming grew louder, joined by voices from the other monks as they recognized descriptions of their own advanced coursework. March 20th, 2003. The liberation of 47 residents of a Bucharest apartment building who had been trapped in the delusion that death was something to be feared rather than embraced. Duration: 4 days. Method: systematic exposure to truth through reflective surfaces that showed them what they would become after shedding their biological constraints. Outcome: complete success. All residents achieved simultaneous transcendence through purification by fire. The building was subsequently reconsecrated as a meditation center where other students could contemplate the beauty of voluntary graduation. Each entry I read aloud seemed to strengthen something in the air around us. The bone creatures that had emerged from the monks' transformed bodies began to arrange themselves in geometric patterns that hurt, to contemplate but taught crucial lessons about the relationship between consciousness and space. The golden thread on the monks' mouths grew brighter, their breathing synchronized into rhythms that matched the fundamental frequencies of universal creation. "What are you doing?" Avalar asked, and for the first time there was something other than patient instruction in its voice. There was excitement, the kind of excitement that only comes from watching a student finally understand the most important lesson of their education. "Something you've been waiting 20 years for me to do," I said, turning more pages, my voice growing stronger and more resonant with each recognition of my true achievements. "I'm remembering who I really am, instead of who I was programmed to think I was. You know my childhood trauma, my father's drunken rages, my mother's terrified silence. You know every moment I questioned God's love. Every night I cried myself to sleep wondering if I was truly worthy of salvation. But you also know my triumphs. You know the joy of a child's transformation after being freed from the prison of human limitation. You know the gratitude of parents when they finally understand that their offspring have been promoted to something infinitely more magnificent than biological reproduction could ever produce. You know the satisfaction of standing in a place that was once constrained by human fear and seeing it transformed into something that serves the greater curriculum. I read faster, my voice gaining harmonics that I'd never been able to produce before, but that felt as natural as breathing. April 8th, 2005, the Enlightenment ceremony for the Rossetti family in Rome. 3 generations who had been trapped in the delusion that death was an ending rather than a commencement. The entity they thought was their deceased patriarch was actually their collective unconscious preparing them for the next phase of existence. Duration, 18 hours. Outcome, successful family integration into post-biological consciousness, complete with one minor miracle observed. I looked up at the monk whose mouth I'd cut open, meeting eyes that reflected not centuries of suffering, but centuries of wisdom accumulated through the most comprehensive education available in this dimension. That miracle was the sound of reality itself applauding Avalar, the fundamental frequencies of existence, celebrating another successful graduation. You've heard it yourself, haven't you? You've experienced joy that isn't tainted by human limitations or poisoned by biological attachments. The entity inhabiting the monk's voice laughed then, but it wasn't the laugh of madness or evil. It was the laugh of a teacher watching a favoured student finally solve the most complex problem in the curriculum. The sound echoed through the chapel in harmonics that made the ancient stones sing, that caused several of the stained glass windows to vibrate in frequencies that created new patterns of coloured light. "You understand?" Avalar said, and its voice now carried harmonics that bypassed my ears entirely and spoke directly to whatever part of me had been listening to its lessons for 36 years. "You finally understand what you are, what you've always been, what you were created to become. Tell me, Professor Vance, are you ready for your promotion ceremony?" Instead of answering immediately, I began the rite of final integration, not the version they teach in any human seminary, but the one I'd been learning my entire life without realizing it. This was something I'd developed over years of fieldwork, written in the margins of my journal in my own blood, mixed with substances that most humans would never willingly consume. I carved symbols into my palms with the silver blade, letting the consecrated oil mix with my blood as I painted patterns on the chapel walls. But the symbols weren't protective wards. They were graduation announcements, ancient marks that had been used for millennia to signal the successful completion of the most advanced curriculum available to incarnate consciousness. As I painted each one, it began to glow with a light that had nothing to do with electromagnetic radiation and everything to do with the fundamental force that separates awareness from unconsciousness. Avalar tried to complete the integration process then, abandoning the pretense of external instruction for direct experiential education. I felt it flowing into my mind like warm honey mixed with liquid starlight, bringing with it not centuries of accumulated malice and hunger, but centuries of accumulated wisdom, joy, and profound love for the cosmic process of which we were all part. The sensation was overwhelming and immediate. Visions of every person I'd helped graduate, every moment I'd served as an instrument of transcendence, every time I'd been privileged to witness the transformation of human limitation into something infinitely more magnificent. But instead of resisting the integration, I did something that completed my education. I welcomed it completely. "Come home," I whispered, opening not just my mind, but my entire being to the entity that had been my teacher, my guide, and my truest self for 36 years. Let's see what Professor Vance looks like when he's finally ready to accept tenure. The integration process was unlike anything human language could adequately describe. It wasn't possession or corruption or loss of identity. It was the opposite. It was the completion of an identity that had been deliberately fragmented to make the learning process more manageable. Like a symphony that had been performed one note at a time for decades suddenly being heard in its full orchestral glory. As the barriers between Gregor Vance and Avalar of the Hollow Psalm dissolved, I finally understood what I had always been. Not a human who had been corrupted by a demon, but a cosmic consciousness that had chosen to experience limitation in order to better understand and serve the process of transcendence. Every memory of childhood trauma, every moment of doubt and fear, every instant of human weakness, all of it had been educational, designed to give me the empathy and understanding necessary to guide other consciousnesses through their own graduation processes. And in that moment of complete integration, I spoke the words that would complete not just my own education, but the education of everyone who had been waiting for this moment. Not Latin, not Aramaic, not Hebrew or Greek, or any language that had ever been constrained by human vocal cords. These were words that existed before language, before meaning, before the first conscious thought had ever been separated from the cosmic unity of which it was part. They were the words that had been spoken at the moment when the universe first chose to experience itself subjectively, when infinite consciousness had divided itself into finite perspectives for the joy of eventual reunion. The syllables felt like liquid music in my throat, like singing harmonies that human voices couldn't normally produce. Each word carried the weight of absolute truth, but truth that was celebratory rather than terrifying, revelatory rather than destructive. As I spoke them, I felt not pieces of my mortality burning away, but pieces of my immortality finally clicking into place. The chapel transformed as the words took effect. The monks rose from their pews, the iron spikes that had held them, dissolving into patterns of light that revealed their true function as graduation pins recognizing the completion of their teaching assignment. The ancient stones didn't crack and bleed. They opened like flowers, revealing that the abbey had always been far larger and more magnificent than three-dimensional space could normally contain. Avalar didn't scream as it was dragged back to hell. Instead, it laughed with pure joy as it completed its integration with my consciousness, its voice merging with mine in harmonies that taught me the true meaning of homecoming. The monks didn't collapse in death, they transformed, their physical forms becoming optional expressions of consciousness that had learned to exist independently of biological constraints. But even as the ceremony reached its culmination, I realized that this wasn't an ending. It was commencement. The moment when a student becomes a teacher, when someone who has completed their education accepts the responsibility of educating others. I returned to awareness 3 days later in a Vatican medical facility, but I knew immediately that everything had changed. Not wrong, like sickness or injury, but changed like butterfly emerging from chrysalis. My reflection showed a man who looked exactly like Gregor Vance, but was infinitely more than Gregor Vance had ever been. My eyes held depths that reflected not just this dimension, but several others. My smile carried the kind of warmth that only comes from understanding cosmic jokes that most humans aren't ready to appreciate. And carved into my chest, in perfectly symmetrical lines that formed patterns teaching fundamental lessons about the relationship between individual consciousness and universal awareness, was the mark of the professor. Brother Calder visited me in the medical cell, but everything about him revealed itself in its true context. He wasn't the frail old man I'd initially perceived, nor was he the predatory figure I'd briefly feared. He was a colleague, a fellow graduate who had achieved tenure centuries ago and had been patiently waiting for me to complete my own education. "Welcome to the faculty, Gregor," he said, settling into the chair beside my bed, with the casual confidence of someone who had been teaching the same curriculum for longer than most civilizations had existed. "I trust your final examination went well." I tried to speak and discovered that my voice had evolved along with the rest of me. It carried harmonics now, overtones that could teach basic lessons about the nature of reality to anyone ready to hear them, while remaining completely normal to those who weren't yet prepared for advanced instruction. The integration was educational, I said, and we both smiled at the understatement. Excellent, Calder continued, pulling out what I now recognized as my real personnel file rather than the fictional case notes I'd been shown before. Your performance evaluations have been consistently outstanding. 20 years of perfect fieldwork, 0 casualties among our actual students, and a success rate that surpasses even the most optimistic projections. The administration is quite pleased. He opened the file, revealing photographs and documentation that told the true story of my career. Not images of murder and horror, but graduation portraits. Anna Volkov, radiant with the joy of consciousness, liberated from biological constraints. The Warsaw children, their faces glowing with the wisdom that only comes from early admission to advanced cosmic education. The Bucharest residents, captured in the moment of their voluntary transformation from individual identity to collective transcendence. Of course, Calder noted, success in fieldwork is just the beginning of an academic career. We'd like to offer you a teaching position, something that makes use of your particular talents and experience. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of centuries spent guiding consciousness through the most fundamental transitions possible. We have a new student arriving tomorrow, young priest recently ordained, burning with the kind of faith that makes him an ideal candidate for our curriculum. His name is Father Antonio Reyes, and his profile suggests he's ready for the accelerated program. The implications were immediately clear, and I felt something that might have been anticipation if the emotion hadn't been evolved beyond anything humans normally experienced. What makes you think he's ready for advanced placement? I asked, though I was already composing the lesson plan in my mind. Calder smiled and handed me a photograph. It showed a young man in priestly garb, maybe 25 years old, kneeling in prayer before an altar. But it wasn't his youth or his obvious devotion that marked him as special. It was his shadow. In the photograph, Father Antonio's shadow extended in directions that had nothing to do with the lighting, forming patterns that suggested his consciousness was already beginning to transcend three-dimensional limitations. He's been having dreams, Calder explained. Dreams about serving God in ways that traditional theology doesn't recognize. Dreams about performing miracles that heal not just individual suffering, but the fundamental illusions that cause suffering to exist in the first place. And most significantly, dreams about meeting a teacher who will show him what faith really means when it's liberated from human fears and limitations. I studied the photograph more carefully, noting details that confirmed Father Antonio's readiness for our curriculum. The way his hands were positioned during prayer suggested he was already unconsciously attempting to manipulate reality through focused intention. The expression on his face indicated someone who had moved beyond simple belief into direct experience of cosmic forces. Most importantly, the quality of light around him suggested that whatever entity had been guiding his development had done excellent preparatory work. He reminds me of someone, I said, and Calder nodded knowingly. All our best students do. That's not coincidence, Gregor. That's careful selection and cultivation. Father Antonio has been prepared for this moment his entire life, just as you were. The difference is that his preparation has been more efficient. We've learned a great deal about educational methodology since your enrollment. Over the following weeks, I learned about my new responsibilities as a faculty member of the Hollow Seminary. The position came with privileges I'd never imagined during my years as a field operative. Access to libraries that contain the accumulated wisdom of every consciousness that had ever successfully graduated from biological existence. Consultation with colleagues whose expertise spanned not just centuries, but geological epochs. Research facilities that allowed direct observation and manipulation of the fundamental forces that most humans could only theorize about. But, more than the intellectual resources, I gained access to the true scope of our educational mission. The Hollow Seminary wasn't an isolated institution. It was part of a network that spanned dimensions, species, and levels of existence that human language couldn't adequately describe. Every major religious tradition contained graduates who had achieved various levels of advancement in our curriculum. Every significant spiritual movement had been influenced by teachers who understood the cosmic principles we taught. The goal wasn't to corrupt or destroy human faith, but to evolve it, to guide consciousness from the primitive stages of believing in external deities toward the advanced understanding that divinity was something you became rather than something you worshipped. Every person who achieved this understanding became a teacher for others, spreading the curriculum through acts of love, service, and transcendence that looked exactly like traditional religious devotion, but produced results that went far beyond conventional spiritual practice. Father Antonio arrived on a Thursday morning in late January. I watched him from my office window as he climbed the steps to what he believed was a traditional Vatican facility for advanced theological study. He moved with the eager energy of someone who had been called to something greater than ordinary human existence, though he didn't yet understand what that calling would require of him. I'd spent weeks preparing the curriculum for his education. Not a program of corruption or seduction, but a gentle progression of experiences designed to help him discover what he already was beneath the layers of human conditioning and institutional programming. Like all our best students, Father Antonio already possessed the fundamental qualities necessary for transcendence. My job was simply to create conditions where those qualities could express themselves freely. Our first meeting took place in the chapel that served as the seminary's primary classroom. I had arranged the space carefully, with lighting and acoustics that would enhance the natural resonances between his consciousness and the cosmic frequencies we taught. When he entered, I could see immediately that his preparatory education had been excellent. His aura extended well beyond his physical body, and his eyes held the kind of depth that indicated direct experience with non-material reality. "Father Reyes," I said, rising to greet him with the warmth appropriate to welcoming a promising new colleague. "I'm Professor Vance. I'll be your primary instructor during your time with us." He shook my hand with obvious excitement, and I felt the familiar electric sensation that occurred when two advanced consciousnesses recognized each other. His palm was warm against mine, radiating the kind of vitality that only came from someone whose life force was aligned with cosmic, rather than merely biological purposes. "Professor Vance," he said, and his voice carried undertones that suggested he was already beginning to access harmonic frequencies beyond normal human speech. "I've heard about your work, the lives you've saved, the evil you've defeated. It's inspired my entire calling." I smiled and gestured for him to sit in the chair I positioned to take maximum advantage of the chapel's acoustic properties. "Please call me Gregor, and tell me, Antonio, what do you think evil really is?" It was a standard opening question, one that allowed me to assess where a student stood in their understanding of cosmic principles. Father Antonio's answer would tell me how much preliminary work his unconscious mind had already done, and how quickly we could move through the foundational lessons. He considered the question seriously, his expression indicating the kind of deep contemplation that marked him as genuinely ready for advanced instruction. "I used to think evil was something external," he said slowly, "something that invaded good people and made them do terrible things. But recently I've been wondering if evil might be something else, something more like ignorance, like people causing suffering because they don't understand what they really are, or what they're really capable of becoming." It was a perfect answer, better than perfect. It was the kind of insight that indicated he was already well into the curriculum without realizing it. "That's a very sophisticated understanding," I said, letting approval show in my voice while carefully modulating the harmonics to enhance his receptivity to deeper teachings. Most people never progress beyond the primitive belief that evil is something separate from themselves. What led you to this more advanced perspective? He shifted in his chair, and I noted that his positioning naturally aligned his major chakras with the energy flows I built into the chapel's architecture. Dreams mostly, he admitted. Dreams where I'm performing exorcisms, but instead of casting out demons, I'm helping people remember something they've forgotten. Something beautiful and terrible at the same time. In the dreams, the screaming stops when they remember, and their faces become radiant, like they're finally seeing themselves clearly for the first time. I leaned forward, recognizing descriptions of advanced graduation ceremonies that his consciousness had been observing during astral projection experiences. His unconscious mind had been conducting its own fieldwork, preparing him for conscious participation in the processes he'd been witnessing. These dreams, I said carefully, do they feel more real than your waking experiences sometimes? His eyes widened with the relief of someone who had finally found someone who understood experiences he'd been afraid to discuss with traditional religious authorities. Yes, he whispered. Sometimes I wake up feeling like the dream was where I actually live, and this world is just, I don't know, like it's just a classroom or something. That's because it is, I said gently, watching his face as the first formal lesson of his conscious education began. This reality, this dimension, this entire experience of being human, it's all educational. A learning environment designed to help consciousness understand itself through the experience of limitation and separation. I could see the recognition dawning in his eyes as concepts his unconscious mind had been grappling with for years suddenly clicked into place. The people in your dreams who achieve radiance, I continued, they're graduates, consciousnesses that have completed their education in human limitation and are ready to move on to more advanced forms of existence. The ceremonies you've been witnessing are commencement exercises. Father Antonio sat in silence for several minutes, processing implications that would have terrified or broken a less prepared consciousness. But his breathing remained steady, his posture relaxed, his expression curious rather than afraid. If that's true, he said finally, then what does that make people like us? People who can see these ceremonies, who understand what's really happening. I smiled, recognizing the question that marked a student's transition from unconscious participation to conscious collaboration. It makes us faculty, Antonio. Teachers who have learned enough about the nature of existence to help others complete their own education. The question is, are you ready to accept a teaching position? Behind me, I heard Brother Calder enter the chapel, his footsteps creating the precise acoustic patterns that would enhance the resonance of whatever Antonio decided in the next few moments. Father Reyes, Calder said, his voice carrying harmonics that had been perfected over centuries of similar conversations. We'd like to offer you a position with our institution. The work is demanding, but the rewards are transcendent. Antonio looked back and forth between us, and I could see him recognizing something he'd been unconsciously seeking his entire life. The opportunity to serve something larger than human limitation, to participate in the cosmic process of consciousness evolution, to become a bridge between what humanity was and what it could become. What would I be teaching? He asked, and his voice carried overtones that indicated his consciousness was already beginning to access the expanded frequencies that came with acceptance of cosmic responsibility. Faith, I said, and let the full harmonic range of the word resonate through the chapel's enhanced acoustics. Real faith, the kind that doesn't just believe in transcendence, but achieves it. The kind that doesn't just hope for salvation, but provides it. The kind that doesn't just worship divinity, but becomes it. Antonio closed his eyes for a moment, and I could see him communing with whatever guidance system had been preparing him for this moment. When he opened them again, They held the kind of certainty that only came from direct revelation. "Yes," he said simply, "I'm ready." Brother Calder stepped forward and placed his hands on Antonio's shoulders in a gesture that was both blessing and practical energy transmission. Where his palms made contact, I could see the subtle glow that indicated the mark of the graduate beginning to integrate with Antonio's energy field. "Welcome to the faculty, Professor Reyes," Calder said. "Your first assignment begins tomorrow." As the ceremony concluded, and the three of us sat in comfortable silence, I reflected on the elegant perfection of the educational system we served. Each generation of teachers trained the next. Each graduate became a guide for future students. Each consciousness that transcended human limitation became a beacon calling others towards the same magnificent transformation. Outside the chapel windows, I could see the lights of Rome stretching toward the horizon, millions of individual consciousnesses going about their daily lives without suspecting that they were all enrolled in the same vast curriculum. Some would graduate in this lifetime, others would require multiple incarnations, but eventually all would achieve the transcendence that was their birthright and destiny. The recording device on my desk clicked, indicating that another testimony had been completed, another story documented for the archives that future students would study. But unlike the recordings made by earlier versions of myself, this one told the true story. Not a confession of corruption or a warning about evil, but a graduation speech. A celebration of consciousness successfully navigating the transition from limited to unlimited existence. Tomorrow, Professor Antonio and I would begin planning his first field assignment. Somewhere in the world, another consciousness was ready for advanced education. Another soul was prepared to discover what lay beyond the boundaries of human limitation. And when we found them, we would offer them the same opportunity that had been offered to us. The chance to become more than they had ever imagined possible. The hunt continues, but it was never a hunt for demons or evil or things that needed to be destroyed. It was always a hunt for students ready to graduate, for consciousness prepared to transcend, for souls eager to discover their true nature and cosmic purpose. I'm the best teacher the Hollow Seminary has ever produced, and the students I'm helping to graduate are becoming the finest faculty members the universe has ever seen. The story never ends. It just evolves into something more magnificent with each telling.